Yes.
Hello, everyone. And for this episode of How I Stumbled Across Jung, my guest is Yvonne Smith Tarnas. And Yvonne is a Jungian analyst, an astrologer, and your Ph.D. was on synchronicity. Is that correct?
Yes, on synchronicity and the relationship within the healing function.
So hopefully we can get on to that in a little while. But I wonder whether you could we start, and could you tell me where you came from and a little about your parents and how you wandered out of the village, that kind of thing?
Oh, that's a great way to enter in, isn't it? My parents kind of come from two different worlds. My mother was born in Germany.
Yeah.
And was there during World War II. She was 8 years old when it started, 14 years old when it ended. And in this small village, she was the only person that spoke fluent English when the Allies came. And so she was the translator for
that age.
At that age. It was very memorable. And it's kind of one of those rare occasions. I think I got some history from my mother, given what wartime Germany was like for many people that were not in the front line, but more experiencing the poverty, the impoverishment that kind of came from all of the supplies going to the front lines. Yeah. She met my father, who was in the Navy. He was there with I think he was stationed in Wiesbaden, and he had come out of a very small town in Kansas, the oldest of 6 kids. Fatherless at the age of 13. So he was kind of like the father figure for his younger siblings. And he arrived in Wiesbaden and saw my mother rowing a boat on the lake. And so he waved to her, said, "Come on over here." And she came over and he said, "Let's go for a boat ride." So he stepped in, and that was the beginning of their relationship.
That's a lovely story. So
yeah. That was 1955. I came along in a few years later, in 58. I grew up on Bainbridge Island, Washington. It's like in a Puget Sound right outside of Seattle. Right. And we moved a lot. My father was in the Navy, and then he decided to work on tugboats. He was an engineer, a marine engineer. So he'd be gone for a period of time and then come back. And he was a restless kind of wanderer. So we often ended up going from other cities to other cities to do jobs and work. So I lived in Texas for a year. We lived in Puerto Rico for a year and a half. We came back. We always came back to Bainbridge Island. And my parents, when I had children later in life, they came and lived with me in California. So we were kind of nomads a bit. But while we were on the island, my mother, I guess most people at that time in the 70s became more interested in alternative concepts. And my mother, I think, coming out of Europe, had been introduced to a slightly more esoteric perspective. And Alice Bailey were a common selection of books on our bookshelf. And she wanted to introduce me to the eccentric neighborhood lady that we had down the street who did astrology charts. So at 14, I had my first astrology reading and I was hooked.
Yeah.
And as I say, that was it.
And were there lots of books and stuff? Was your mother a big reader, Yvonne? And
both of my parents. Yeah, both my parents were. Instead of the TV might be on with the news, but we all had books that we were reading in the living room together. Yeah.
And broad-minded, your mother and father, they were kind of more open.
Very broad-minded, more open, kind of prototype hippies.
Before their time.
Yeah, before their time, definitely. And I think, I was probably the most conforming member of the family, as I wanted to fit in every time we moved into a new town. So my parents would be these sort of eccentric people she was German, which was always sort of a unique thing, particularly in the Northwest. And certain areas of the country that were more kind of, I don't know, provincial.
Yeah.
So,
Mm.
yeah.
And tell me about the astrology. Why were you hooked? And yeah, why? What happened?
Why? Well, what happens when we're 14, right? We're starting to notice that there's other people in the world, particularly the opposite sex, but also wanting to be popular, wanting to be able to have a kind of social experience that was positive. And I learned enough to realize, you know, my friends were different signs. And then I started doing charts to try and figure out what was happening, what were my friends like? What was I like? What was this cute guy in my algebra class like? You know,
Right.
so it became sort of a way to kind of.
I just need to butt in there. There are no cute guys in algebra classes at all.
Okay, maybe I was into the intellectual look. I don't know.
Yes,
Maybe somebody who could help me.
And tell me, just from your own chart, what are maybe one of the two things that strike you as interesting? You know, because often for the lay people, isn't it, they go for the sun sign or whatever, but what do you think is interesting
about my chart? Well, I'm born at a particular time that I was trying to find my chart so I don't have to remember it off the top of my head. You know, I'm born at a particular time in 58 that had a Jupiter-Neptune conjunction in the sky. Now, for those of your listeners that might not know what that means, that Jupiter is all about expansion, potential, higher mind, potentially also. And Neptune is also more oriented towards spirit or healing, or kind of the kind of oceanic depths of connection with our soul and spirit, and the two together kind of give a particular mystic fascination, energy. And in my chart, those are in an opposition to Mercury. So it's a way in which one might use their mind to tune into more expansive spiritual ideas, but also with that Neptune being somewhat open to, you know, a greater expansive communication, as it would be hooked up to Mercury, can have a kind of psychic capacity to a sensitivity, we might say, to other people's thoughts and feelings. And most everyone born in that time had it.
Do you have a little that? I would imagine so. Yes. As a therapist as well. So
yeah, I do.
Yeah. Do you call that intuition sometimes?
I do. I call that intuition. If we did the Myers-Briggs, I'm an INFJ. So that's an intuitive feeling type. And that's pretty much led me most of my life. I like having a thinking function, but my intuition is far superior.
And I remember Carl said once that intuition, it's like the arrow can hit the target, the bullseye, or it can fly off into the forest. It's like this wonderful thing, but sometimes it kind of it's not 100%, is it? But it's a wonderful faculty.
It's not 100%. It's a wonderful faculty, but you always have to hold, I think, a certain amount of humility when you get something, because sometimes it's our own material getting projected out onto the situation.
Yeah.
And so one has to be mindful, if we're intuitive, to how we're perceiving and what might also be true. You know, holding a kind of duality to our perception of that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
And Yvonne, then I remember when we were talking before, you went into the corporate world then, didn't you? And what was happening with the astrology at this time? Did you put it on the back burner, so to speak, or were you?
You know, it was always present. You know, I always was doing charts. It was sort of a sideline because I think partly due for a lot of personal reasons, but I wanted to have something that had a more respected professional kind of allure than being an astrologer. You know, it's not exactly looked upon on high as a big, important profession.
Yeah.
So I became a graphic designer. I went to the University of Washington in Seattle and got my degree in design communications. And then I went to New York and I began working for a number of design companies as a junior designer, then a senior designer. And that's when I went to the Strand bookstore that one day, looking through the books, and Carl Jung's book, Man and His Symbols, fell off the shelf above me on my head. And I bought it.
And you didn't get any concussion or anything like that? But
no, it was a paperback.
And what did you like about? I mean, what pulled you in to that?
Well, the whole symbolic perspective. As a designer, part of my skill and what had been commented on a lot in my program as I went through school at the University of Washington was that I had a really good grasp of the symbolic perspective, because part of the design is to really find unifying symbols that a person could look at a poster or a magazine or an image and have a pretty good sense of what was going to be conveyed by that image. We speak in symbols all the time.
Yeah.
And for me, that Jung's book brought in a whole nother level of psychology that I was fascinated with. And I felt like I already was working in the language of symbols.
Yeah.
I had it with astrology. I understood it in terms of this creative form that I had taken. And I began to realize that there was another level of it. And I began applying it to my dreams and those of my partner and friends. Yeah. And it was interesting to me.
And were you having a lot of dreams at that time through?
Sure. That would have been my Jupiter return period, which is a very expansive time. But remember, I have Jupiter conjunct Neptune, so the dream world gets very active. So that I had a lot of dreams and an understanding that I was going to be moving soon. So I stayed in New York for 2 years and then came to the West Coast and started working in San Francisco.
Oh, as a designer, or
yeah.
And so, how did you end up at Pacifica Graduate Institute? How did that all happen?
Yeah, it was a bit of a circuitous route. I continued doing astrology while I had done design. Then I had my sons. My first son I had in 93 and my second in 95. So I had pulled away from working, except doing some consulting work here and there for people. But I was always doing chart reading, astrology charts, I should say. Yeah. And I realized that my skill level was now at a point where I was starting to open people up, and I'd be sitting with them and coming right in almost like psychologically, surgically.
Right.
And then suddenly the session's over and this person's just laid open, and I didn't really know how to help them come back together to walk out and use the material in an effective way.
So you opened them up but never stitched them back together again.
I tried, but it does take a little bit of skill to know how much to open up. Yeah. If you're doing a one-time session, you don't take everybody right into a trauma situation or something like that. So there was a lot of realizing that I wanted to do more.
Yeah,
I loved what I did on a consulting level. And then I found Pacifica's master's program, which is for an MA to become an MFT, that's marriage family therapist in California.
Yeah,
I decided to go into that when I was 44. So that was my midlife crisis.
And a change, a very much big change. Sometimes, Yvonne, I think there's chapters, and sometimes when you look back, you probably look back to that chapter in the corporate world, and it's like it's almost like a different life, isn't it? It's kind of like what I always think. That's what they don't teach you at school. That you've got. It's like Odysseus going to those islands. You've got that island there in the corporate world, and then you've got this other whole new chapter that starts, and it's very different.
Yeah. It's very different. It's almost like new facets of self have to kind of come into experience and grow. Yeah. And then some contribute to other parts, and some you leave behind.
And you had a dream to get. Did you have a dream? I tell you why I remember. You mentioned something about it, but when I found my place here, and next in Cottesloe. A couple of days before, I had a dream of a home, and it had a blue wall. And anyway, when I came, there's a wall that's blue, and I kind of knew I was in the right place. And I remember you told me when you went to Pacifica, something similar happened to you, didn't it?
No, I had several dreams. In fact, even one of the head of school kept a number of my dreams to share.
Really?
There was several. Yeah, I'm trying to think. There's which one to tell you. Well, one of the ones that I had while I was at Pacifica and looking at going for an internship at the Jung Institute. This would be coming in as an intern where you're not fully licensed, you're working on your licensure.
Yeah.
I dreamt that I was on a boat, a great ship, and it was in the water, moving fast. And I could see we were coming into a harbor, this incredible village city on a hill with clouds and old buildings, kind of very much of a European sort of look to it.
Yeah.
And then I looked down at the ship I was on, in the front of the ship, and I guess that would be the bow. The tiles, I realized, were scales of lapis lazuli.
Right.
And then I looked up and saw the front of the ship with
what is lapis lazuli?
Lapis?
Yes, what's that?
It's a precious stone that is very blue, and you see it in a lot of I think mystical, ancient religious work, early religious work.
Right.
You know, I wish I could say more clearly. There's probably even better descriptions.
Yeah.
But I realized after I looked at it that they were scales. And then I looked up and realized I was riding on a dragon that had formed itself into a ship. And we were coming into the harbor of Jungian land, of all places.
Really?
And I told my analyst at the time, she goes, "Oh my God, you're going to get into the Institute. That's a sign." And I did.
Yeah, it was a sign.
Yeah, it was a sign.
And so you started doing the courses, and your dissertation, Synchronicity, what's it all about? What was the guts of it?
The guts of it. Well, there was an inspiration, then that developed the guts. What I had noticed when I was an intern with patients was there was this uncanny kind of quality of biographical parallels popping in,
Right.
you know. And I also was in charge at that time. We all had little tasks in my internship to fulfill for this agency. And mine was to basically keep track of our Medicaid patients. And what I noticed, what we did with the Medicaid patients, rather than using their name, we used their birth date for confidentiality. Yeah. But by this time, I had infiltrated the intern group and knew everybody's birth date and had done their charts, of course, right? Because that's what I do.
Yeah.
And I could see that these patients coming in had the same sun sign as the therapist that they had been randomly assigned to in several different situations. And I also could see that, or I knew that one person whose chart I did was having a particular transit, and the patient they were getting was going to sit right on that same transit.
Yeah.
And I thought that was fascinating. So I began to collect data and put together a proposal. And from there, I developed a study of 30 clinicians that had remarkable parallels with their patient. And then I further demonstrated with the astrology. Astrology is a subset that can be taken out to discuss this synchronicity. But the biographical piece that we find in the healing work of therapists, physicians, people who do massage or body work is very consistent.
I know.
And they're matching.
I know from some time ago, I went to India when I was young, and when I went back to Sydney, I started to teach some meditation. And I found what was incredible is sometimes if you were having a little bit of an issue about a particular topic or whatever, that someone would walk in and bring up that exact same issue. It's that it's kind of like you're learning from the, like, you know, some people see it old school teachers, student kind of teaching, but it's not quite like that. It's like someone's bringing in something that you need to to
to
look at.
work on.
Yeah.
Well, Jung talks about that in his Psychology of the Transference, that we have to get into the fire with our patients and become melt down with them in order to really work the material, because they bring into us something that we have to engage with personally to change, and they change.
But do you find that easy, really speaking?
No.
I mean, we like to be a bit remote, meaning, a bit, what is it? I mean, there is a little bit of a thing about therapy, isn't it? That you're the one that's got it a bit together and someone else.
Yeah.
It's something to lose, isn't it?
It is something to lose. And I think that's going through the analytic training to become a full analyst is to get in touch with that resistance and then learn how to work with that, because we do want to remain outside of the mess. If we think of Jung would call it the prima materia, but it's basically slogging around in the deeper garbage of our lives is what we all try to avoid. But that's what gets brought into therapy, and we have to enter into it. And it's challenging.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And just going back to synchronicity for a while, is what happened with that? Did you do more study on that, or you took that group?
Well, I wrote the dissertation, and then I've continued to work with it in looking at romantic relationships, first meetings, and sort of what comes out of it in work relationships, not just healing relationships, and they're very consistent, but I think the healing relationship, particularly if both are open to being connected through that process, is one of the more profound ones. And I find that true with, my fellow clinicians at the Institute. Their patients that they work with that bring that level of transformation. It's not just the patient that gets it, the therapist does too.
So how does it all work? I mean, what's your take on it, really? Is it that, as below, so above, that there's a psychic reality and somehow the world is a reflection of the psyche? Or and I have another question. I'm just jumping ahead here a little. Is that
go ahead. We'll mess around with all of them.
I'm into James Hillman, and he often talks about the daemon, and sometimes I think perhaps the daemon leads into synchronistic events. It's like the daemon, that what is it, tutelary spirit, or the unique spirit that someone brings at birth or whatever, and that wants to be awakened in life. They seem to be, but then events happen, like your event, with being introduced to astrology at 14 years old or whatever, or Carl Jung's book falling on your head. So is it your daemon, or is it synchronicity, or is it both? Or what's your take on
it? I'm sitting there, I'm listening to you talk about this, John, and I'm thinking, I think it's kind of both. I mean, I think the synchronicity is a shorthand reference to something that's at much deeper work in our lives. The daimon, to me suggests the soul journey, or something along that line. That'd be another way I might say it to someone, that opens us into experience. And the ones that the types of experience that grow us into ourselves are not usually the easy, happy ones. They're the ones that push us into an experience that tests us to develop not only a connection with our unconscious and the parts of ourselves that we haven't engaged with yet, to bring it into form and consciousness and begin integrating it. And it's sometimes it's really great. Falling in love for most people is often feels like a synchronistic kind of meant to be type of moment.
Yeah.
But we all know that not the relationship doesn't stay perfect. It's usually you have that little period of being in the Garden of Eden, and then you got to get back to real life, and the real person's other stuff comes in.
Yeah.
And you have to adjust.
That's what we call shadow too sometimes, isn't it?
Yeah. Our shadow work. It's always around.
Yeah. So, so synchronicity, and how then you've gone in and you've become a therapist. And how do you still use dreams as the basis of your therapy, or?
Oh yeah, if they come in, but there's also there's so many ways that I think of it as the um, when we listen to someone over time, they often tell the same story, or they come back to the same story. We kind of perseverate over an issue for a while.
Yeah.
And for me, I'm listening, but I'm also listening with another ear, so to speak, where I get distracted. Why am I getting distracted? What am I thinking about when I get distracted? And that element might be important, and I make a little note around that. Sometimes I get insight into something that it's like, let's move over this way a little bit, and let's begin talking about this other aspect of this piece that we keep revisiting. There's something opening up. And to me, that suggests a kind of opening of consciousness in the patient who keeps telling the same story, as well as me being able to finally see now after laying down the same story. And so there's a synchronicity of a different sort with that. It's like when we're ready, the element or the meaning of something will appear. There's also an experience many of us have where we'll listen to a patient's dream and see some element of the dream in our own imagining of that dream, bring it into the discussion, and it means something to the patient. It's like the dream comes alive. So there's just the synchronicities, I think, kind of show up in different ways. It's like tuning in, like a fine radio signal that you start to figure out how to tune it.
And being open and receptive might be another way to describe that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Being open and receptive and curious, including around one's own negative feelings. As the clinician, we like to think we only love our patients, but we also have feelings about them, and those are really important to be connected with too. Why is that here? Is this in other ways? Does this person, is this part of this, how this person relates? Is it how I'm relating to this person? It's an endless inquiry.
Okay. And the Jungian world, Yvonne, can I give you a bit of a free association test? Are you happy to do that?
Yeah.
I'm going to mention a few people. Carl Jung.
Oh,
so I say someone, and you just give it whatever comes. Carl Jung.
Okay. Man before his time.
Yeah. Louise Von Franz.
Oh, visionary. Rock. Translator of Jung.
Yeah. Liz Greene.
She's kind of like, to me, the queen of astrology, at least in terms of how I wanted to enter into it. She led the way with what's the name of her book on Saturn?
There's an old devil, a new look at an old devil, or something like that.
A new look at an old devil. That's right. That's a great book.
I think one thing about Liz Greene is she's got that very scholarly part, but she's also very engaging. Relates to practical life, so that she's got both, which is kind of a nice mix.
She does, and interestingly, both Liz Greene and Louise Von Franz are two of my heroines of Jungian astrology type of things, and they have very similar charts.
Right.
Yeah.
Good intellects.
Kind of carry a good intellects, but also a sort of serious an ability to kind of really lead a different vision of both astrology and Jungian psychology, and bring it into a deeper engagement for a larger public. You know, Von Franz, I think, explicates a lot of Jung's material in very tangible ways.
Yeah.
And I think Ms. Greene does too.
Where people can go, using a bit of backyard language, where people can go a little bit mental reading Jung in terms of his associations. Yeah. And also he jumps from epoch to epoch and century to century and around, which I love, but some people find that not the best.
Like that too, but he's also, this is my perspective, sometimes he's showing off, throwing his Greek, his Latin, you know, you've got to be able to to kind of catch it all in it's slow reading.
And just, I mean, I want to check with you just quickly, if you think this is accurate. I always see Jung as a very, very mercurial kind of fellow. Do you think that would show up in
his chart?
Yeah.
You know, Jung's chart, I'm trying to remember his chart off the top of my head. He's very Neptunian more than mercurial.
Right.
To me, he's very Neptunian. You know, he kind of is able to sort of be in this world, but I think he also had access to many other worlds. His ability to have vision and to enter into other past experiences. I mean, his take on alchemy, it's almost like he went back there and
into
was
that
able
time.
to time travel.
Yeah. Okay, good. Well, a couple of more. Stan Grof.
Oh, he's amazing. What a transformative figure for so many people with his breath work, his understanding of the psyche, the perinatal states, just powerful work, contribution to psychology. And I wish that more of psychology would take a look at it further, to embrace it, because it's so present, at least as I see it in my work with patients, that early perinatal and postnatal trauma, challenge, life, I mean, just regular situations do carry marks that help us understand so much of the present life of an adult.
He strikes me as someone who he's very grounded in depth psychology, and he's got that kind of gravitas, but he's also very way before his time, I think. And a lot of people know about Stan Grof, but a lot of people don't as well. You know, I mean,
a lot of people don't.
Yeah,
but
treasure over there.
He is very much a treasure. He's changed so many lives. You know, he brings all of it together, Jung, Freud, and then this transpersonal world in a kind of very cohesive way. And really, it's experiential. You know, if you've done a breathwork session along the lines that he's worked with it, it's profound. It's quite profound.
So someone that's taken from the tradition of depth psychology, but also has probably made quite a contribution in his own right.
Oh yeah, very much so. He has a whole other distinct, I think, contribution that is just beginning to be really taken up. I mean, and he's still around, so it's really precious to kind of hear him talk about some of his work still.
And James Hillman. And I want you to clear up something for me too.
Sure.
Yvonne, you said that you see a lot of the trickster in James Hillman. What do you actually mean by that, and how would you explain that?
He likes to turn things on its head. He liked to take ideas that might have been precious, particularly Jungian ideas, and flip them around. I actually pulled a quote for you from Edinger. Right. I don't know if you know this quote. He was being interviewed, I think, by one of the Jung Institutes. And they said, would you care to say what you think of Jim Hillman's work? They called him Jim. And he said, well, Jim Hillman is an interesting phenomenon, I must say. Very bright, intelligent, knowledgeable, but he's not related to the reality of the psyche. He's an author. He's got a literary and artistic mentality rather than a scientific psychological mentality. He's kind of an intellectual playboy who can dazzle people with his brilliance and play around with images and ideas, but he's not the genuine article. He's a living example of what Jung warned us against, namely the aesthetic attitude toward the psyche. He leaves out the account of the moral dimension, the ethical dimension of relation to the depths. In fact, he scorns it. And you know, to me, Edinger is such a senex in this interview where he's got, you know, Hillman is the total puer. And to me, just the way he describes
and a playboy as well.
Yeah, intellectual playboy.
Which is a little out of date, that word. It's about 35 years out of date now, but anyway. It touches on something. I don't know, you know, whether you're happy to talk about this, but sometimes I find, you know, just in my travels around the place, that sometimes I see like the Jungian school, you know, it's a bit strict sometimes. You know, I saw a paper, I got a paper on academia a couple of days ago, and it's about someone attacking archetypal psychology. You know, it's not Jung or whatever. And then I see people that have been very inspired by Jung. I would mention someone more like a Thomas More or whatever. They've gained inspiration from Jung, but they're a little more open to other influences, and you know, Ficino from the Renaissance.
Ficino. Oh yeah.
And I don't know. I'm not mad about the group thing, the Jungian thing, when it becomes, and you're kind of close to a lot of that there, I would guess. And what's your take on?
Well, the Jung Institute of San Francisco is, I think we've got a pretty big membership around, I'm going to probably get this wrong and pardon my fellow analysts, but I think we're around 250 analysts there.
Yeah.
But everyone kind of brings a different, they bring them their self into this type of work. And I feel that's why I like the Institute where I come out of, is that there's sort of an acceptance and a nurturing of the individual coming into the Jungian world and the Jungian work with their particular skill set. Now, the Jung Institute of San Francisco does give a kind of equal weight to Jung. Well, I wouldn't say equal. Jung's kind of dominant, but it's very informed by the psychoanalytic, because Jung didn't really bring in a lot of clinical material. And so we borrow the psychoanalytic to kind of help language some of the nuances of the clinical experience. But we have, the Von Franzian group in our institute, the archetypal group, the astrology group, we've got the classic form and the more clinical form.
Yeah.
And so it's got a pretty good marriage. And I think like the LA Institute we have down in LA is much more, they've got a more von Franzian kind of orientation, but they also carry a very strong clinical perspective. So it's kind of cooking still. Everything's cooking in most of these institutes.
So in your language too, maybe just a little tension between factional groups can also, help the cooking.
Oh yeah, that's going to be there. Yeah. Yeah. Different positions on how we want to present, or but generally it's I haven't felt like it got into full out battle at any point. It seems pretty congenial at I might be wrong, but it seems like I've learned a lot from just having both being available at our institute.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
And going back to Hillman for a second, the trickster. What's your take on it?
Well, he turns things upside down, What's my take on the trickster or Hillman?
Well, both. Yeah. Both.
Well, when I read Hillman, which I'm going to have to kind of go back into the archives of my brain with what I've read on Hillman. He takes up the idea, and then he kind of gets he kind of takes it in, presents it, and then he seems to take it apart. He likes to argue. He likes to debate. And I kind of find that interesting. It kind of a very active form of engagement with concepts and ideas. I found his book, The Terrible Love of War. I don't know if you've read that book. Fascinating as a way of taking the Venus Mars, the pageantry of like a football game, and carrying sort of similar essence of our need to kind of carry that archetype of the warrior forward and how that lives in our culture. He sort of plays with things. He was very, I think, instrumental in kind of bringing things to the surface and not just going into this kind of I don't know, abeyance to Jung's ideas as being precious. He sort of knocks it around.
He does, yeah. And I have thought, in a sense, individuation, wouldn't it be taking some of those ideas and inspirations and dreams and putting one's own personality, stamp, flavor, according.
Well, that's part of the work of an analyst, is going to have one's personality and flavor mixed in, right?
I think so. Yeah.
I think so. I don't think you can, this is not surgery, even though we have a fantasy of being able to kind of to do no harm, to enter into a situation, be the healer, and then come back out. And I mean, to me, in my work and that of my colleagues, it's messy. We're going to get in there and turn things upside down. We're going to come out changed ourselves if we're doing the work right. And it's not always comfortable.
And would you say that's what you've learned from being an analyst?
Yeah, how to be with my discomfort in a way that allows me to still think and participate, as well as be curious. I think I practice a form of curiosity to every situation at this point, and just wait to see before I react or have an opinion, form a concrete opinion on anything, because it's kind of allows a lot more growth to happen, a change or a metamorphosis,
But if you're in the Myers-Briggs thing, if you're are you a J?
Yeah.
Don't they
I'm
like
an INFJ?
Don't they like? I mean, I
everything
would be
buttoned up. Yeah.
So that's kind of like learning. That's the other side, the competence.
Yeah, I'm learning how to be a P as a J. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
That's a growth area.
Yeah. And we've got to continue this word association for just a little while. This is not on the Jung world.
Okay. Okay.
Saturn.
Father. Limits. Black. Delineation. Maturity. Depth. Healing.
I think, Yvonne, I believe it's a big thing to understand Saturn in your life as a bit of a classic puer. I think, perhaps a few years ago, that I would say I've learned a lot from Thomas More off that one, in the sense that his chapter on the gifts of depression, and his sometimes he intimates that perhaps that melancholic part of his nature has been the thing that's taken him deeper, and you can see I can see a beautiful wisdom that's maybe come out of that
by far. Well, and that that Saturn kind of is another symbol for, say, the prima materia, the garbage deposits that we carry within us in different ways, whether it's our self image or, the uncomfortable history that we carry. That's the prima materia. That's where we get to use to grow something new. And that's the gifts of depression, definitely. Yeah.
I think for puers, they don't like, if you think of the 60s puers, they didn't like the old man much, did they? Or the gatekeepers or the institution.
Over 30.
No, anyone over 28, I think was, but it's kind of like, it seems to me that it's an area which is really of a lot of importance, the youth, the old man, the coming to terms with that and coming to terms perhaps with the old man or old woman within inside of ourselves or whatever. Yeah.
Well, and we're going to meet that Saturn, old man, old woman, old self, resistance, difficulty, depression, every 7 years. That's the cycle of Saturn making hard aspect to itself in our chart. And that's from an astrological perspective, so significant as stages of life that we really look to as kind of indicators. You think of 6, 7 is when we start our formal schooling, 13, 14 is when we begin, develop social structures, relationships with other. And then we have the 21 where we're emancipating into our life and beginning our sense of adulthood. And then we have 30, which is the classic midlife, the 30-year-old Saturn return, which we're dealing with at a whole nother level of maturity.
And was that sort of was that around the time that you made that change from the corporate back? Was it associated with your kind of change or not really?
Well, I think for me, that's a whole other thing. Let's see, 30. I started becoming more put into a role in my design career as being like the boss. I had a team of designers that we were doing packaging and product development for the company I worked for at that time. And then I worked for Apple also at that time. And I started to have a sense of that I didn't want to be a designer anymore. I could tell that I didn't have the libido this wasn't going to answer my deeper needs. So the disenchantment comes in.
Yeah, that's a very Saturnian kind of thing, a little bit of disenchantment. But not such a bad thing sometimes. You need to die a little before the new growth can.
Very well put.
And tell me, Venus.
Venus, love, the feminine, the daughter. Oh, it's just, it's beauty, it's grace, it's value, it's worth. It's, I think of it in all the kind of flower colors when I think of Venus. Pink, white, blue, red. So if we add Venus to Saturn, we have a sort of classic beauty.
It's funny. I mean, going back to Thomas More for a second, I also get a lot of Venus from Thomas More. I think I've learned something about
do you?
It's funny sometimes in the mail, but it's someone that loves kind of beautiful things around them, beautiful books, the feelings of the texture of fabrics, that kind of thing. It's do you think?
Go ahead.
Do you think we understand Venus in our culture?
I think we have perceptions of it. I think different people have more ability to respect or be in relationship to Venus than others. There's a focus sometimes on the value of something being more important than, the actual quality of it. The values of persona can be very oriented toward beauty as a certain type of importance that is not particularly full of the depth that we might want. One can get stuck on the surface level with Venus. Venus, I think, is a really important part of how we relate, represents relating to others with love, to be able to be in connection. But Venus itself is the attractor. It's not necessarily the kiss. That's Mars with the Venus that brings in that,
Right.
let's consummate.
Mm.
Let's get that thing cooking here, something new.
Mm. And Uranus, last one.
Oh, unexpected breakthrough, genius, light bulb. It's a disruptor at times, and it can be electrical, sparks.
Do you have a little of that in your chart?
Yeah, I sure do.
So as a Taurus, does that help, you get out of the paddock, so to speak?
Well, it's in hard aspect to my sun, so I kind of think of it as the stepping on the banana peel type of aspect. I think I'm doing okay, and then the floor has come out from under me, right. And it forces new perspectives into my life, when I don't think I need it, but I actually do. And so I find it very useful.
Are you in good relationship with that part of yourself, would you say?
I think I'm in better relationship with it, John. That's the thing with Uranus. It's not like it's going to get all warm and cozy and we're going to just make friends. It's I'm in relationship with it, so I know when I'm in a Uranian dynamic. And I also have Uranus right on my sun by transit for those astrologers listening out there. So that creates a little bit more of a kind of activation around awakening, new birth. That's Uranus also brings that in.
Makes it a little bit more of an influence, perhaps, or something like that. Is that what you're saying? In my language.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. It kind of brings more energy in.
Good. And Yvonne, could you speak a little bit about, maybe towards this kind of final part of things, could you talk a little bit about this time and this time that we're in, which has been an incredible time, and a time of lockdowns and incredible transition in the world, sometimes called a collective rite of passage or a death rebirth mystery.
Yeah.
How do you see it? What?
Yeah, I'm going to speak kind of from more the individual perspective that might lead us into the collective view. But because I work with people on a daily basis, and I have most of my caseload, we've been through a pandemic together, going from in-person to online and then back to in-person, back online because of the different breakouts we've had. And just generally speaking, I feel that so many people kind of met the challenge of COVID with a certain kind of curiosity and, openness, along with the tragedy that occurred for so many that lost people or were compromised with their health, that they're going to be continuing to deal with long COVID. Yeah. It's been a kind of real wake up to so many aspects of people's lives. Am I with the right person? Am I in the right job? Am I in the right home? People moved, changed jobs, changed partners. A lot happened. It really created a lot of change. We also had during this period is the Saturn Uranus square in the sky. And that is kind of like a breakdown and breakthrough type of energy that went on during this COVID. So, the old systems don't work, like the power grid in Texas that broke down during the winter last year. That's kind of a great symbol for, Uranus is electricity and Saturn's the structures. We've had, to deal with in America, the political system that is undergoing a complete breakdown, and who knows what's going to happen yet. I can't speak too much on that. That's not where my focus tends to lie, but it creates a general sense of unrest, at least in the population I work with, a sense of, what's going to happen next and how can I make a difference? And then we have climate change. So there's a sense that time's up and one needs to kind of either engage with their life and the ways that they can to improve not only their lives, but those that are important to them. And try to show up in a different way. A lot of changes happened. Have you seen that in your experience?
Very much so. I don't know, what is it, the consensual reality of pre-COVID, or the official story, if you want to call it that, perhaps has a strength around it. Okay, you have those people talking about new paradigms and other paradigms, but it's like some of that old stuff has just collapsed away, and I think I'm just saying the same thing as you in different words, but it's almost like throwing people maybe back onto themselves, which is good, and not necessarily an easy thing, but a good thing.
It's a good thing. My experience, it was a good thing. I ended up working more internationally than ever with COVID and learned a lot about what was happening in other parts of the world. And it's been very educational for me. And I carry that into my work with everybody. It's kind of an expansive perspective. And that's what I think has come out of this. It feels like we're not so provincial, perhaps, as we used to be. We have to become more globally aware, hopefully.
Yeah. And a lot of people doing that kind of work, perhaps. I mean, do you feel pessimistic about it at times, the situation, or do you feel optimistic? I mean, how is it like a 100th monkey thing that, if X amount of people start to do this work and the psyche changes, that kind of the outside can change a little, or is that a little over optimistic and perhaps a little naive?
I don't know. I appreciate that perspective, John. I think my focus is not getting too far beyond where I'm at or where my patients are at. It's kind of like dreaming about the healing perfection of the world. To me, removes us from being in the present. So I don't really live in that place of possibility. Sure, I hope that we figure out a solution to climate change, and in the United States, I hope we figure out a better system of how we're going to govern. But I don't spend a lot of time sort of with that perspective. It's with the individual process. Like I'm kind of in the weeds.
Yeah, no, I get that, and I guess you'd have to have that kind of faith to do the work that you kind of do. That, and perhaps if someone changes, an individual changes just a little bit, I often think like that change reaches out somehow.
Exactly, like a ripple effect that could, create change for a lot of people.
Yeah.
That's my hope.
Yeah. That's good. Oh, well, it's been a pleasure speaking to you, Yvonne, and I hope you have a good evening over there. And
I will, and it's been a pleasure for me too, John. Thank you so much. It was really fun.
Thank you.